Muted.
To talk about this really important topic. Thanks for joining us. We appreciate your interest in helping keep Wi-Fi strong for your communities. And today we'll be discussing a technically complex but really important issue, and that's LTE-U. I'm going to give you a little bit of background and then I'm going to turn it over to Chris. But, recent experiments by cell carriers may jeopardize publicly available Wi-Fi in your communities and even harm your residents' home Wi-Fi devices. So we have an expert panel today to share their knowledge about LTE-U and why it might harm your community connectivity, likely will harm your community connectivity unless we write clear rules of the road for how these new technologies will interact with Wi-Fi. At the end, we're going to ask you to contact the International Standards Agency to make sure we have good rules that allow fair play between cellular and Wi-Fi networks. During the call, we will be keeping all attendees on mute so we can keep the ambient noise to a minimum, but please do take a moment to check and make sure you're on mute, and we will also try to ensure we're on mute when we're not speaking. We are recording this call, so if you have folks in your community that need to hear this message that weren't able to be here today, please be sure to share that information. We do hope you'll participate in the webinar, and we encourage you to use the chat function on the bottom right. You can either send it just to the organizers, to everyone, just to me, but we will make sure to share your input and get your questions answered. If there are terms used you don't understand, please ask. You certainly won't be the only one. If you're unsure of how this impacts you, please ask. We really want your participation. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Chris Mitchell to introduce our panel. You there, Chris? Okay, we have some technical difficulties, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. And I will ask Michael if you will introduce yourself and get us started.
Hi, Deb. This is Chris. It looks like Michael Calabrese is still on mute.
Okay, let's see if we can get Michael straightened out here. Okay.
I'm on the phone.
Oh, I can hear you.
Can you hear me? Oh,
yes.
Oh, here it is. Yeah, maybe that was Chris's problem too. Apparently you have to unmute both the phone and the screen. Okay, well, I will proceed then. I am Michael Calabrese. I direct the Wireless Future program at the Open Technology Institute at New America, which is a nonprofit policy institute in Washington, D.C. And we've been actually working on these issues of expanding public access spectrum, in other words, expanding public access to the airwaves and improving Wi-Fi and encouraging community Wi-Fi solutions for more than 12 years now, believe it or not, since these things were new issues. So we're involved in all the different FCC proceedings. I'm violating the acronym rule already, Federal Communications Commission, on behalf of the Public Interest Spectrum Coalition, which is a large coalition of all kinds of national consumer media reform, education, library, civil rights, and other groups here in DC. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to give some basic background because I think we have a wide range of people on the call. Some of you know all this and some don't, but just as kind of a quick preliminary, spectrum itself is, of course, what we all refer to more commonly as the public airwaves, and it's simply the range of electromagnetic frequencies that are useful for transmitting and receiving information. So it's generally the very low frequencies, and that in turn extend up, of course, ultimately to to light waves, which we don't typically use for that purpose. It's a unique resource, so it's important to understand that spectrum is infinitely renewable. From one moment to the next, it's completely restored again in terms of its capacity. So it's not scarce in theory. Uses are constantly evolving with technology, and literally the public airwaves are a commons. In every country in the world, they are owned and controlled exclusively by the government, of course with licensing. Regulators divide spectrum into bands of frequencies and allocate them for various purposes, which you'll see in the next slide. Here are some of the, so here is a incredibly oversimplified picture of the spectrum that's most typically in use for communications and some of the most common uses. And of course, the FCC began assigning spectrum back in the 1920s with radio, where it's the lowest frequency of things in common use, and then proceeded on to television. And by the time we got up to cell phones in the 1990s, we started auctioning to mobile carriers, and everything was licensed until later. And we keep moving up the frequencies and diversifying the way we access the airwaves. On the next slide, you'll see an incredible crazy quilt chart. Looks like one of your urban planning charts, no doubt, or zoning charts. And that's all the assignments. So almost all the airwaves, certainly what's considered the usable or valuable airwaves, are assigned to someone. And the way the FCC works is it allocates bands of frequencies, first to a general type of use, such as TV or satellite, and then it assigns them to specific users, most commonly by granting an exclusive license that comes with protection from interference. In other words, others are prohibited from using those same frequencies in any way that would cause interference to the licensee. What evolved much later, principally in the 1990s, is unlicensed spectrum, or I should say in the 80s initially. Unlicensed spectrum is where the FCC authorizes the operation of Wi-Fi and other low-power transmitters in certain bands without the need for the user to obtain a license. So this unlicensed spectrum is open to any user, but you must be using FCC-certified equipment that conforms to certain operating conditions. And Wi-Fi is a great example of that. It must operate at low power, in other words, extraordinarily low power compared to, say, cellular networks. So that means it's aimed for local area coverage. It may not cause harmful interference to any licensee, but it must accept any interference. And you probably noticed that occasionally if you pick up a baby monitor on your walkie-talkie or some such thing like that. Going to the next slide. So unlicensed access is subject to certain rules of the road that have so far avoided a tragedy of the spectrum commons. It was, there's been, in the beginning there were warnings that, how can we possibly rely on unlicensed spectrum for something like Wi-Fi, because everyone will be sharing it and it'll just be a classic tragedy to commons. But that actually has not occurred, in part because of the sharing protocols, the fair sharing protocols that Wi-Fi uses to preserve the commons. So like public highways and open shipping lanes, unlicensed sharing is open to all, and it's actually extraordinarily efficient for low power uses. And my final slide will, and this may be a surprise to a few of you, it was just 5 or 6 years ago, the chairman of the FCC was talking about an impending spectrum crisis that was set off by the rapid uptake of smartphones and video on mobile devices. But what actually occurred is no crisis at all. And the reason is that today, Wi-Fi is carrying roughly 80% of all mobile device data traffic. That means, what that means is when consumers, when individuals are on a smartphone, tablet, laptop, they are about 80% of everything they're doing on those devices never touches licensed carrier spectrum and never touches a cellular carrier's towers or their infrastructure at all. 80% of it is being transmitted a very short distance over unlicensed spectrum into a wireline connection that is being provided for a more basic purpose. So, of course, you're most familiar at home, at work, in a Starbucks. There are wireline connections that are just taking that traffic. It's being handed off the unlicensed spectrum and being backhauled by the wire, and that's allowing us, that combined with the spectrum reuse of small cell Wi-Fi is meeting public demand at a much more affordable price than it would be otherwise. And some recent economic studies have shown that Wi-Fi generates over $200 billion annually in economic activity just in the United States. And it's certainly a major, major factor in making mobile broadband connectivity much more fast, ubiquitous, and affordable to residents of your city. And it's particularly important to low-income folks who, the Pew Internet studies have shown, are disproportionately relying on their mobile devices for either, if not their exclusive, at least their primary Internet access. So I'll turn it to Chris
Michael
Szymanski now.
Sorry, I can introduce him now that I'm back and my microphone is working. Thank you for that. I think I just have two quick clarifying questions. One is, for how long is spectrum, if it's allocated to someone, is that forever? Do they own it? And I know this is complicated, but if you can just briefly answer.
Legally, there is no ownership of spectrum, but for all practical purposes, it's controlled indefinitely by the licensee, particularly if you acquired it, at auction, because the licenses are a maximum of 10 years, but they are automatically renewable. Great. Which has been proven a major headache for the FCC because they can't, they're finding it difficult to reallocate. That's why we're having an incentive auction right now where television broadcasters are being bribed to turn back in some of the spectrum they were given free so that it can be, auctioned in turn to, to the cellular carriers.
Thank you. And then the last question is, particularly for some people who might not be able to see the slides, it looks to me like the amount of spectrum that is dedicated to unlicensed usage is very small compared to what's been allocated for the cellular carriers, and yet most of the data travels over those small areas. Is that right?
Correct. Particularly in what you might call the beachfront spectrum, because the value of spectrum is just like real estate. It's location, location, location. And, the low band spectrum, which is, for example, what television and radio use, that is just extraordinarily valuable because it slices through buildings, trees, goes long distances, whereas the more high frequency spectrum has lesser propagation characteristics. So most Wi-Fi traffic, and Chris can, when he comes on, can supplement this, but the vast majority of Wi-Fi traffic is on 80 megahertz, 4 channels of spectrum at 2.4 gigahertz, which is mid-band spectrum. And the mobile carriers have, upwards of 300 in that range to carry about a fifth as much traffic. They do provide quality of service, though. That's the big difference.
Right. Well, thank you for that. I just wanted to make sure people had a sense of how much work is just being done in these incredible bands. Next, we're going to turn to Chris Zmansky, the Director of Product Marketing and Government Affairs for Broadcom. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks, Chris. So, as mentioned, I handle government affairs and product marketing for Broadcom. And for those of you that are unfamiliar with Broadcom, we're one of the world's largest telecommunications semiconductor companies. We, combined revenue of all of our entities was somewhere around $15 billion last year, and we estimate that 99.98% of all data crosses at least one of our chips. So I'm not sure what happened to the other 0.02%, maybe a rounding error. I work for Team Wi-Fi, and one of the first things that I wanted to point out was this chart from ABI talking about the cumulative number of shipments worldwide and then those that are still installed. And the trajectory here is staggering. If you look at 2016 worldwide, you're talking about approaching 10 billion installed devices and over 15 billion that have been shipped. And so Wi-Fi has really taken off, and that's not even calculating or factoring in some of the emerging Internet of Things devices. Next. Next slide, please. And Michael already covered on this, so I don't want to go into too much detail other than to tell you that, with the advent of the smartphone, and really the very first Apple iPhone, what you had was a real mobile data spectrum crunch. The applications and the ability to access, using 3G technology, is a huge enhancement to the user experience beyond, the old 2G edge, technology that AT&T really had to grapple hard to address demand. And one of the ways that they did this was through Wi-Fi offloading. Then the phone manufacturers began to more and more attach Wi-Fi chips into the phone so that consumers could conscientiously turn on Wi-Fi and use that as their means for consuming data. And now where you are is over 80% of all wireless traffic going over Wi-Fi. And part of that is the economics involved. If someone has a broadband connection, because Wi-Fi is so universal, you can go into the local department store and buy something, or you can go and get something a little bit more solid like an enterprise AP. But the economics, the cost per data is much less than other forms of wireless technology. Next. So one of the things that we were looking at is the fact that, as Michael had mentioned, in certain underserved communities, Wi-Fi is sometimes the only means for Internet access. And so trying to look at this from a city's perspective, whether you're trying to make broadband ubiquitous, similar to the great work that New York is doing, I know well beyond New York Link, but I mean just really, really innovating in terms of providing broadband access. Or you just Google McDonald's and Wi-Fi and Starbucks and Wi-Fi, and you see all of these stories where, teachers are giving homework that require Internet access, and yet some of these communities have a lot of residents that don't have access to broadband. So the library closes down, maybe the Wi-Fi turns off, and these consumers are going to other places in order to get their Wi-Fi access. Next. So Wi-Fi, because it's a global standard, and there are so many different companies and scientists that participate in the standards body, it's constantly evolving to meet new and emerging use cases. So in 2012, there was a standard, a Wi-Fi standard, that was focused on improving the range and providing extremely fast throughput, 1.3 gigabits per second. So to put that into perspective, average home with broadband connection, if you're not in a major metropolitan area, is probably going to be somewhere between 20 and 100 megabits per second downlink. This is blisteringly fast. And so this, single router could serve many, many, many different consumers and still provide an excellent broadband experience. In 2014, the innovation on advancing that current standard was really to figure out how can we better serve these dense user environments. As Michael had said, in these areas where you have a lot of congestion, a lot of users, you could have a lot of harmful interference among the users. So how could we provide a better user experience and make those airwaves even more efficient and provide a better, more seamless experience? And right now, where we're evolving is trying to provide more of a carrier-grade experience. The seamless association, making it easier rather than going from one hotspot to another where it's a little bit painful, logging back on, being authenticated in your device so that you're recognized on any authenticated network. And it's almost like going from cellular tower to cellular tower, making it super easy and seamless to connect. And when we talk about enhanced traffic prioritization, not all data is equal. Some data is very sensitive to delay. If you think about real-time voice over Wi-Fi or peer-to-peer Wi-Fi for like Xbox game streaming, or if you think about FaceTime video, extremely latency sensitive. And if you think about the next generation, the things that everybody's going to be unpacking in around 2017 and 2018 and Christmas is going to be all about the virtual reality. And virtual reality requires extremely low latency, which means very, very limited delay throughout the entire network. And so we're innovating to ensure that we can deliver that sort of consumer experience. In 2017 and 2018, what we're talking about is providing Wi-Fi that has greatly extended range, even lower levels of delay, and so much more spectral efficiency. So Michael was talking about spectrum being like some of it is beachfront property and some of it, maybe a little less desirable. We're looking at ways to take that less desirable spectrum that was previously regarded as a junk band, in improving the efficiencies of technology so much that it's like building a multi-family dwelling on the same plot of land. Building up, finding ways to be far more spectrally efficient so that we can be a better steward of this resource and ultimately provide a better consumer environment. And the focus really is for outdoor as well, outdoor environments. Next slide. So as Wi-Fi evolves, as I showed you in that previous slide, it does it in a way that it protects the hundreds of millions and billions of Wi-Fi devices that have already been installed or in use. It's very friendly. So each evolution of Wi-Fi is such that it will be friendly to the previous version of Wi-Fi. That means that someone installs a new Wi-Fi router or they use a new Wi-Fi device and someone else is working on something that was installed 4 or 5 years ago, the newer device would not harm that older device. There would be no impairment to anyone's experience, which I think is an important point. So unlicensed LTE and how it will be deployed. So first, LTE was designed for a licensed network. So what Michael showed was that racetrack. Or that road, that highway for spectrum. So I like to think of licensed spectrum as a racetrack. You own that land, you own that racetrack, and so you get to determine the rules of the road to manage network efficiency. And so that is how these cellular technologies, LTE, were designed. What a handful of companies have done is modified this cellular technology so that it could be moved from the racetrack to the public highway. And they want to use the same highway that Wi-Fi is currently using and growing in, where all of the innovation is taking place in Wi-Fi. These cellular companies want to move this unlicensed LTE to those areas. And so why are they doing this? One, well, licensed spectrum is extremely expensive. That's one. And two, there are some limits to the amount of licensed spectrum that are available. And unlicensed, it's very easy to deploy devices. There's another flavor of this unlicensed LTE that is being standardized by a global standards body called 3GPP. And this is called LAA or ELAA. And the key point I want to get across to you all here in this slide is that LTE unlicensed, whether it's LTE-U or LAA or ELAA, pick your acronym, is going to be deployed in densely populated urban areas. The reason it's being deployed in densely populated urban areas is that it's going to be subject to the same limitations that Wi-Fi is subject to, meaning limited power and going into airwaves that aren't well known for providing distance at those lower powers. And so this is more of a local area network technology. So they're going to be deploying in places where you already have robust Wi-Fi deployment. They're not going to be going out into some blue ocean or green field and deploying these technologies. Next. Next slide, please. Yeah. So Broadcom, we're heavily technology driven. Over 70% of our employees are engineers and are working in an engineering role. Very few marketing. I'm the only person that does government relations for my company. So that puts this into perspective. But we do a lot of engineering and testing. And our testing has demonstrated that Wi-Fi links, Wi-Fi that's already been deployed in the homes and in the fields are going to be severely degraded by this unlicensed LTE. Proprietary LTE-U is going to be a disaster. The standards-based version called LAA is going to be a lot friendlier than LTE-U, frankly. It should protect some Wi-Fi traffic. However, when it comes to Wi-Fi coverage areas and access, and concerns about impact to real-time latency-sensitive services, we are very, very concerned that LAA will be super disruptive. And what we provided is a little hyperlink, and hopefully this presentation will be shared with you all afterwards. But those blue hyperlinks at the bottom of this page are actually letters from the standards bodies that developed Wi-Fi and are constantly developing Wi-Fi. And the certification body that's enhancing it and ensuring that it delivers the experience that we all want and expect. They sent these letters to the cellular standards body saying, hey, wait a minute, if you're going to deploy this technology where we already have billions of devices, consider these things, okay? Next slide. So here, what we wanted to do is sort of depict this is the coverage area for a typical outdoor hotspot in an urban area. And this is a representation of the fantastic Link New York project. If you haven't been out there, boy, it's so fast. It's right in downtown, downtown, 7th, 8th Avenue. Just beautiful. And really high-speed connection. And about 90% of all of the coverage area of an AP is at a weaker or a lower level signal strength. And when I say a weaker or lower level signal strength, even going to the outside edge of the circle that disappeared, that would have provided enough throughput, a good enough connection where you could watch a high definition movie on Netflix. So it's still a very good connection. With LTE-U or LAA being turned on at a lamppost, it has the potential to interfere to such a great extent that it could reduce coverage by up to 90%, the geographic area that you could coverage, which basically means that either you're going to install more hardware, more devices, which is going to require additional backhaul and additional investment, or you're not going to provide the same level of coverage. Likewise, if you have some cities and municipalities that are providing school buses that are equipped with Wi-Fi routers and you're trying to park it overnight in an underserved community, you're expecting a certain coverage range or geographic area coverage. So if this unlicensed technology is not made more friendly, it could shrink that coverage zone to 10% of the original size. Next slide. So you have a similar phenomenon that goes in the home. So this is a Wi-Fi heat map. Don't go forward yet. Oh, can you back up if possible? I want to describe. So in this Wi-Fi heat map, you have your internet on one side of the apartment, and office, den, whatever. It's generally a broadband connection. And what happens is your signal gets weaker and weaker as it has to travel through walls and doors and floors and windows. And so what this shows is how your signal gets weaker and weaker as it travels throughout the house. Once again, a router configured like this would be sufficient for whole home connectivity, even in places that aren't traditional center of the room broadband, like a Nest smoke alarm, or if you have a Wi-Fi enabled refrigerator or something else. So these aren't traditionally areas that people had designed Wi-Fi for. It was traditionally for someone that was sitting in the center of the room, right? But a Wi-Fi router, a modern day router, would be sufficient for whole home coverage and good solid throughput. If you turn on that LTE-U or LAAE node B, and you can go ahead and click through again, what you'd see is the distribution would change. That heat map changes, and you could lose coverage in certain rooms. Once again, based upon the positioning of that E node B or that small cell, that cellular signal. And there are some assumptions that go into this, how high is the E node B or that, cellular, how far is it from the home, but these are realistic assumptions.
Chris,
and so, yep.
Sorry to interrupt. I think you're making the point very well. We had a specific question about it though, which is whether LTE-U would conflict with all of the 11 Wi-Fi channels that can be used, or just some of them.
So LTE-U is being designed right now for 5 gigahertz spectrum, so not for 2.4, but for 5 gigahertz. And it's being designed right now for channels that don't have to share with government radars. And so if they don't implement mechanisms that would allow sharing with government radars, then they would be limited to about 8 channels within the 5 gigahertz spectrum.
So can you simplify that a little bit in terms of just having a sense of whether, does this basically degrade all Wi-Fi, or is it that there are fewer usable channels?
Well, it's only when it's operating co-channel. So the idea behind providing a faster connection and a better user experience involves bonding channels. So for Wi-Fi, the faster Wi-Fi, the more modern day Wi-Fi, you could bond 4 channels to give you that fast throughput. We're working on Wi-Fi that can bond 8 channels, okay, which is up to 160 megahertz of spectrum. LTE-U and LAA are trying to do the same thing, which means that if they're both occupying the same channels, right now you only have 3 80 megahertz channels in the 5 gigahertz band. Okay, you only have 3 of them available. And if you have 4 carriers that are deploying LTE-U or LAA, or you have other people that are using Wi-Fi, everybody's going to be contending from the same channels. If you have interference, it would either force you to go down to a smaller channel and reduce throughput, or it would provide interrupted service in the channel that you're using. It all depends on the interference scenario.
Thank you. Please continue.
Yeah, so next slide. This is just more of the same. So this is the Starbucks or McDonald's, right? And so if you just click through, this is an indoor hotspot providing coverage outdoor, full premises, picture cafe. And once again, looking at sort of a downtown environment, please click through one more time, you would no longer have full premises coverage. So next slide. And final slide. So the conclusions here are that proprietary LTE-U would be a disaster for Wi-Fi, and part of the reason for that is that it's proprietary, which means that the technology isn't shared. So as Wi-Fi evolves, it can't take into consideration any evolution in LTE-U. So there's no way they could learn enough about one another where they could always coexist. Very problematic. Even LAA is likely to significantly reduce Wi-Fi coverage area unless improvements are made to the technology. And we believe that the specifications have to be fixed to operate more fairly with Wi-Fi before it's deployed. Otherwise, it's going to harm people that have already made, made investments. And so the standards body that's working on this technology, we are working hard. We and other Wi-Fi companies are working hard, but this is a cellular standards body. It's not a Wi-Fi standards body. But we're working hard in that body to improve the coexistence mechanisms so that it'll work well with Wi-Fi. We're trying to get the standards body to reply to the IEEE and to the Wi-Fi Alliance, the two bodies that have sent letters of concern. It's critical that they respond to that. And so this issue, oh, go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry, I don't mean to, I was going to say, I just want to be very clear that you're not saying LTE-U can't happen, it's that it has to happen in a particular way that better fits with the history of how unlicensed spectrum has been managed.
Yeah, because these technologies in unlicensed spectrum have evolved over 15 years. There's been a lot of learning. It would be like you going into a conversation. You haven't listened for a second, and you start interrupting and talking, and you have no clue, you had no context, and you go and interrupt a group that's been meeting for 15 years. So they need to consider the current users of this spectrum and design their technology so that it better coexists with those users. We're not saying it can't happen. We think that the non-standard version cannot happen because the technology is not shared enough so that others can understand it and develop products that it will evolve and coexist. We do believe that the standard version can coexist or could be improved, but they need to slow down and address some of the concerns that have been raised by these Wi-Fi bodies.
Great. We have another question that's going to lead right into Josh, but I'd like to just make a quick point from either Michael or Chris, if you can address this. Local governments, do they have the power to just tell companies they can't operate in this spectrum?
I'll defer to Michael on some of this, but our perspective is that governments are users. When you look at governments like New York City and others that are deploying these wonderful broadband projects, or providing access, governments have a voice and they can weigh in by sending letters both to the standards body or to the FCC, the U.S. government agency that's responsible for these regulations, and say, hey, consider our citizens. And these the regulatory bodies have to consider the comments from everyone. And so in this way, cities can represent the voices of the underserved that wouldn't otherwise be able to comment on this. That's my perspective, but I would open that to Michael.
Michael, I'm not hearing you if you're muted. But that's okay. We can move on to Josh. But I think the point I wanted to make is that local governments have a lot of authority, but it does not extend to spectrum, and so the local governments are not able to basically determine who is transmitting and who is not. So this weighing in is probably the most important thing we can do right now. And Josh, I think you're going to tell us how we can do that. Josh Breitbart is the special advisor for broadband at the Office of the Mayor in New York City, and I know from personal experience has been long involved with working on how to make sure the internet is as great as it can be for the vast majority of people. Josh, are you with us? Looks to me like we have our callers are unmuted except for two of them. I don't see your name in the list, so I'm suspecting that if you are on the line, you are in a you're on the phone, not in this actual system. Max, are you available also from the city of New York? That can.
Hey folks, hey everyone, it's Max Sevilla
Thank you,
with
Max.
New York City. Hey, thanks for doing these and for organizing. Josh is on the line. He's probably having an issue with unmuting, but I'm happy to get us started. So,
yeah, you need to push the talk button on the screen too.
For Josh.
For Josh, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, Max, perhaps you can begin, and if Josh can cut in, then we'll switch over to him.
Sure, absolutely. So Josh just emailed me. He's on the phone. He'll be with us in a second, okay? So New York City, I'll summarize some of what Josh plans on saying, but New York City has been very aware of this issue of LTE-U. We have, under Mayor de Blasio, we've made a very conscious effort to expand the availability and access of broadband to all of our residents, particularly the communities that historically have been underserved, believing that Wi-Fi internet access is a critical component of bringing about equity for all city residents. And therefore, Mayor de Blasio has been making investments in building the broadband infrastructure. In doing so, we have prioritized the investment both in the public domain through initiatives like links, which has been spoken about earlier, but also in building infrastructure in our public housing developments. We've got about 500,000 people, 500,000 or so public housing residents in New York City, and so we're looking at investments. Sorry, Josh just emailed me. He's having some technical issues here. So we're looking at investments in our public housing, and in doing so, the mayor has made commitments to both provide the infrastructure as well as provide free services for a number of years in all 5 boroughs, initially in 3 developments. Now that number has been expanded to 5, and we're looking to expand that even further. So the technology of LTE-U concerns us because as we continue to look for ways to connect our residents, and as we continue to spend millions of dollars of our taxpayers' money, we want to prevent the potential of having new technologies that interfere with that access that we're looking to create. And so we recently wrote a letter sharing our investments and sharing our strategic plans for broadband access and expansion, and explaining our concerns with the technology. We share these with the International Standards Body, and we ask to be included in the work that they do henceforward, in all the testing, in the conclusions, and that they take into account the experiences of cities like New York City and others in order to foresee what potential implications these technologies may have in the initiatives that we are developing. And I think that that this concern and this communication with those testing the technology has been critical for New York City, but I suspect that a lot of you on the phone, a lot of other sister cities ought to share that same sort of concern and engagement. It's in part has to do with the technological requirements, but it's really about being a part of the conversation and making certain that those that are looking into these technologies and the implications of it have in mind the impact that these technologies will have in the efforts that we are all making to connect and provide opportunities for our residents.
Great. Well, thank you for the leadership of New York City on this, making this such an issue, and also I think making it easier for other communities to get involved. We have time for more questions if anyone wants to put them in the chat window. But I think following on that, Deb, would you like to make some comments now about how people can get involved? Deb, are you with us? I'm feeling like I'm in pretty good company with my initial microphone problems here today.
Well, you know, I was chatting away on mute. We actually will send to everybody once again. We've sent it once before, but we'll send again a copy of the letter that New York City has sent to 3GPP, which is the international standards body. And we will send you a draft letter that you might take and adapt for your city, and also send to 3GPP should you choose to do so. We're also working on a fly-in for those signers of this letter who would like to learn more about what's happening, get an update, and share with legislators in DC sometime in the fall. We think that would be a really powerful next step for those folks who are really concerned about this issue. And that based on what I could see from New York City, I think there's really cause for concern here. And so we wanted to make sure that you were aware of what was going on and that you had an alternative for responding and participating in advocating for what you need to ensure your citizens have their Wi-Fi needs met.
Wonderful. So we have a couple of comments which I'd like to summarize. One I'll read partially verbatim because I think it really cuts to the heart of the importance of this, noting that communities use Wi-Fi for smart meter energy management, traffic management, police, fire, and ambulance services, classrooms, library, and public spaces, and just so many different things. Businesses in your community are dependent on Wi-Fi to work for inventory management, tracking and shipping, payment systems, and then there's all kinds of individual uses the way we all use it. And I think it's really important to note that this unlicensed space is so incredibly important to keep it useful, not just because of Wi-Fi, but because of the fact that anybody can just go and get a product that is going to work on Wi-Fi, and they don't have to ask permission, they don't have to wait for an approval process. This is something that when I talked with Seattle about this issue in December of last year about Wi-Fi, they were the lower level people that work on the ground, and a lot of the departments were saying they can just do this and make it work. They don't have to go out and get a license or anything. So we have to really protect it. There's a question that is regarding the amount of mobile traffic that is already onloaded or overloaded into Wi-Fi, and there's a question of whether, I think it's getting at whether or not the mobile carriers are harming Wi-Fi merely from pushing so much traffic onto Wi-Fi rather than using their dedicated connections. And I'm curious if Michael or Chris want to deal with that quickly.
Yeah, I can. This is Michael. I didn't want to raise this before, but in the context of that question, I will tell you, as I said in the beginning, we are very, my Open Technology Institute, we're very active as part of the Public Interest Spectrum Coalition, which includes groups such as Consumers Union, Consumer Federation of America, National Hispanic Media Coalition, American Library Association, and others. And the status of this with the Federal Communications Commission is that the FCC last summer put out at our request actually, put out a public notice asking for comment on this issue. And our coalition filed comments, and we raised, two additional concerns. One is that we think that the timing of this is extremely suspicious because right now you have other companies looking to compete with the traditional cellular carriers, particularly Verizon and AT&T, looking to use what they call Wi-Fi first offerings. So the cable industry, because of their wireline infrastructure, Comcast, for example, has already turned, by the end of this year, they say all of their customers, both residential and business, into Wi-Fi hotspots that will create clouds of Wi-Fi connectivity. And so given that 80% of the traffic is connecting via Wi-Fi to wireline anyway, you know, they could have competing offerings, and Google has a Wi-Fi first offering. So we're a little suspicious about the anti-competitive motives, and also maybe more importantly is the fact that right now consumers, there's a very clear distinction right in the face of your smartphone. You know whether you're on Wi-Fi or on cellular, and they're two separate realms, and you know when you're on Wi-Fi there's no marginal cost and that it's not being counted against your mobile data caps. And so as long as you're on Wi-Fi, you're not deterred from using the internet. And we're afraid that what they may be trying to do is to monetize what today is Wi-Fi, free Wi-Fi traffic. Because
right.
If this goes forward, the consumer won't be able to tell whether they are on the cellular network or on Wi-Fi, and they could get charged for the use of the public spectrum.
Well, we have a couple of minutes left. Josh, can we get a couple of words from you? I'd love to hear your voice.
Yes, and I am on now, and
great.
Thank you all. So the only thing I would add is that, you know, Chris, I think you were speaking to this, or you know, whose question you're reading. You know, just that the Wi-Fi ecosystem is incredibly complex and dynamic.
Oh, I'm afraid we might have lost him. So we have a quick question where we'll hope that he gets back before we run out of time. That's how fast do these letters need to get out?
The faster the better. So the standards body, the global standards body is finalizing its first version of this technology, and that's going to happen in June sometime soon. They're working on the next version of the technology, which will be finalized in the beginning of 2017. And so the way they work on this is they'll blueprint. They'll say, we want to work on these issues, and we want to make sure that fixing this this issue is added to their blueprint, to their agenda. And so the faster, the more cities that weigh in, the higher the likelihood that they'll actually be motivated, because they want to deploy this technology in your cities. If you have concerns, then that might actually make it harder for them to deploy.
As people are writing their letters, Chris, are you available to help them?
Absolutely. So we, like I said, we have thousands of engineers that can help review. And I know that Wi-Fi Forward, which is the association, principal association that we participate with on these issues, has offered itself up as a resource. And Michael Calabrese answered the question with respect to, spectrum, but I just want to make sure that the caller, the person's question was fully answered. As cellular is offloaded to Wi-Fi, there is no problem, because Wi-Fi would still be fair to itself. So under the existing system where carriers are offloading to Wi-Fi to get that internet into the, get into the ground, that's Wi-Fi competing against Wi-Fi. Everybody's abiding by the same road rules. With LTE-U and LAA, it's like creating a HOV lane, a high occupancy lane, and you get your traffic through for your subscribers, but you create a traffic jam in all the other lanes. So that's really the fundamental difference with this technology. I wanted to make sure
Excellent.
that we answered that.
We have just a couple more questions, and I want to make sure we can get to them. So to the extent we can answer just quickly like that, that'd be wonderful. Is there anything cities should be doing regarding their DAS or small cell policies and approval processes that would help or be involved with this in any way?
that's a complicated question. I would just simply say that there should be some form of interference test to make sure that the enterprises and building owners that are currently expecting a certain level of service and they've spent all this money are going to continue to be able to provide that level of service before these items are deployed. But I'm not sure what the legal rules would be in terms of how to go about that.
And Michael, you're free to jump in at any point. I want to make sure you're not talking into a muted microphone. We have another question, which is whether any legislators have been engaged in this issue. Is this something the states or the Fed are showing any concern about, the federal government?
So in the House of Representatives and the Senate, there are 2 committees with jurisdiction over the FCC, and those committees have been actively involved. This is a highly technical issue, so it's been more involvement at the staff level, but those committees have been involved and have been engaging with the FCC and with industry.
Okay. I think we've dealt with the questions. I'm sorry that Josh got cut off, but if I had to guess, I think he would be reiterating just how important this is in terms of the amount of damage that would be done to cities' abilities to make sure that everyone has high-quality internet access if the spectrum is rendered less useful. So I think this is very important. I think it's a fairly low barrier to entry to write a short letter in which you say that this spectrum is incredibly important for all of your constituents and city functions, and that the standards bodies really need to be involved along the lines that that Chris and Michael have mentioned. I see that Michael's left, but we will have contact information for getting in touch with the various folks that have pledged support. We'll have the letter that New York City has led on and other resources available to you, and will be available as well. Deb, is there anything else?
No, I was just going to say the same thing. If you have any questions about next steps, if you need more information, if you want to hop on a call and ask questions directly, if you need assistance writing your letter, if you want somebody to review your letter, we are happy to help with anything that is that we can do to help. It's important work. It's complex and technical, but we as cities really want to protect the opportunities for our citizens. So we will keep you updated as this debate moves forward.
And I want to just end on one other note, Deb. You noted it's technical. It is technical, but we don't have to be technical to weigh in, and I think that's really a key point.
Absolutely true. We can actually weigh in based on the outcomes that we currently anticipate for our citizens and the way that those outcomes will be impacted. You don't have to weigh in on the technical side.
So we will get this information out. We thank you all for your time.
Thank you all.
Thank you especially to our presenters. Sorry.
Yeah. Thank you.